As Israeli attacks in Lebanon continue despite a ceasefire, the United States is hosting the third round of talks between Lebanese and Israeli officials. Hezbollah opposes the meeting in Washington. But can the process help find a way forward for Lebanon after decades of war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The U.S. is hosting the third round of talks between Lebanon and Israel. For the hundreds of thousands of Lebanese living in makeshift camps or made homeless by Israel's latest attacks, the tranquility of Washington must seem like a world away. For decades, Lebanon's people have suffered war at the hands of Israel, which in turn says it faces threats from groups like Hezbollah. A powerful force in Lebanon backed by Iran, the group is not involved in the talks and has refused U.S.-Israeli demands to put down its weapons. So, what's this process hoping to achieve? And what's the biggest obstacle to peace in Lebanon? We'll discuss this with our guests in a few moments, but first, this report from Narges Mobalaghi.
Despite last month's US-brokered ceasefire, Israel continues to attack Lebanon. 2 strikes targeted 2 cars south of Beirut on Wednesday. Since Israel launched its latest invasion in March, at least 1 million people, or a fifth of Lebanon's population, have been forced from their homes. Some will have no homes to return to, with entire villages leveled. In Washington, the US is intensifying its diplomatic drive. After 2 meetings last month, Israeli and Lebanese delegations are in Washington for US-brokered talks, just days before a ceasefire expires on May 17th. They are expected to discuss the ceasefire, Israel's occupation in southern Lebanon, and whether the Lebanese state can reassert authority in the south, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. But Hezbollah isn't at the table. Israel wants the group disarmed. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem says its weapons are not up for negotiation.
Nobody outside Lebanon has anything to do with the weapons, the resistance, or the organization of Lebanon's internal affairs. This is an internal Lebanese matter and not part of the negotiations with the enemy.
Despite the talks and the ceasefire, Israel has intensified its attacks on Lebanon. Israel killed at least 15 people, including 2 children, and wounded several others in Wednesday's attacks.
Since the ceasefire, there have been 1,502 casualties. What a ceasefire it has been. Some 380 people have been killed during a ceasefire.
Hezbollah is also launching more attacks, increasingly turning to explosive fiber optic drones. Guided by thin cables instead of radio signals, the drones are difficult for Israel to jam. Israeli officials say they have become a persistent threat to their troops. And these negotiations are taking place under the umbrella of a fragile ceasefire between the US and Iran, and the standoff in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has preconditioned its own negotiations with an end to hostilities in Lebanon. The stakes are high and the obstacles many for all parties involved, and time is not on their side. Narges Mobalaghi, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests in Beirut. We're joined by Rizk, a security and foreign affairs analyst. In the U.S. state of Colorado, we have Jennifer Gavito, a former acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern affairs. And also in the U.S., in Minneapolis, is Rami Khouri, distinguished fellow at the American University of Beirut. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Ali, let me start with you today. Just the fact that another round of talks between Israel and Lebanon is happening, how significant a development is that from your point of view, and what do you think can be achieved?
I wouldn't put too much into these talks. I think that the more important aspect is going to be what happens between Iran and the United States. That's what's going to determine, I think, more than anything else, how the situation is going to play out in Lebanon. And I think that these talks basically, more than being about achieving some kind of a truce on the Lebanese-Israeli front, They're actually more about the disarmament of Hezbollah, an anti-Hezbollah agenda. And so we see the United States once again adopting the very same Israeli goals, which are to isolate or to curb Iranian influence in Lebanon through the destruction of Hezbollah or through the elimination of Hezbollah. But again, I don't see that these talks are going to lead to much. And I think that Hezbollah has become even more important for Iran than it was before the war which was launched against Iran for various perspectives, not just ideological, but I think also strategically speaking as well, Hezbollah now is increased or has increased importance. So if the Lebanese state doesn't give anything or shows that it's incapable of taking tangible action against Hezbollah, I don't see these talks leading anywhere. Now, there have been some ideas floated by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for example, about vetted Lebanese army units. I think that if they follow through on that, that's basically going to lead to a catastrophe in Lebanon and civil strife. But that doesn't mean they might not do it. I think we've gotten used to this administration that they're willing to do quite a lot without carefully considering the consequences.
So, Jennifer, let me get your take on this. Ali there saying that he expects the U.S. to be adopting the Israeli goals and not really expecting much to come out of this round of talks. Where do you stand on things? What do you think can or cannot be achieved in this round of talks?
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I think that these talks can both be important, and at the same time, we can acknowledge, as Ali said, the likelihood that very little substantive will come out of them, at least at this stage. They're notable in that this is the first, the third, but the first round of direct discussions between Israel and Lebanon in decades, and that alone is significant. Time and again, Hezbollah has drug Lebanon into war with Israel, a cycle of violence that doesn't benefit the people on either side of that border. And so the opportunity to sit down and start to develop ongoing contacts is in and of itself, to my view, a positive development. But I do tend to agree with Ali that the circumstances are probably not yet there for any sort of broad agreement, not least of which, as he referenced, because there is so much divide within Lebanon itself about Hezbollah's role, therefore making this quite controversial there. For the United States, I do agree that this is tied up in a lot of ways with what is happening with Iran. One of the early objectives of this war, and conceding up front that we have heard a lot of different objectives for the conflict with Iran, but one of those was to degrade further Iran's proxies in the region, not just because that's an Israeli agenda, but because those have repeatedly over the years also struck out at American interests. And we see that with Hezbollah, certainly, but also with the Iran-aligned militia groups in Iraq, for example. And so the United States is using this, I think, to start to build a little bit of trust between the parties and open that dialogue. Again, that in and of itself, I think, is a worthy goal. And most importantly, if we can use that to eliminate, at least for the time being, any return to all-out conflict, then I think that would be a very positive development and is what the United States is specifically seeking out of this round of negotiations. Now, the ceasefire is barely holding, as you noted in the report, with violations, significant violations by both sides. And so, nobody is under any illusion that the conflict has subsided. But again, if it can preclude a return to open war, then I think that is a positive development.
Rami, both Ali and Jennifer were talking a lot about Hezbollah. And the reason I mention that is because the fact of the matter is that Hezbollah is not present in these negotiations. Hezbollah is opposed to these talks taking place. Israel wants the group disarmed. We know that. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem says that the group's weapons are not up for negotiation. How do you bridge this gap? Where does that leave things?
I think you have to bridge it by going to the root causes of the situation, which includes the conditions, political realities inside Lebanon, the behavior of the Israeli government, which has totally supported by the American government and other Western governments in their aggressive attacks against Iran or Syria or Palestine or Lebanon or whoever they're attacking this week. And you have to look at the causes rather than the consequences. I think the American approach and the Israeli approach looks at the consequences, which is a strong Hezbollah, an armed group that is trying to repel the Israelis, get them out of Lebanon. 7 times Israel has invaded Lebanon, and 2 or 3 times has stayed there for a long time. So the consequences are that Hezbollah developed and is trying to resist and push the Israelis out once again. Most of what Hezbollah is doing is defensive. Most of what Israel is doing is offensive and aggressive, occupying land. And the scale of what Israel is doing now is similar to what they did in Gaza, which is driving out over 1 million people, destroying entire villages. It's not a genocide, but it's certainly ethnic cleansing, and it seems to be fully supported by the American government. So we need to sort out the causes and the consequences. The 2 countries should be able to live peacefully if one is not aggressing against the other. That's what the negotiations should try to achieve. The Lebanese government is desperately trying to reassert its credibility, its efficacy, and its legitimate sovereignty over the territory of Lebanon. And this has proven to be very hard to do in the last 40, 50 years because of Israeli actions. Other external, the Iranians certainly have played a role with their support of Hezbollah, and other people have. The Saudis have played a role in supporting some of their Lebanese allies, and the United States has played a role. So I think these are it's a much wider, more complex issue than simply disarming Hezbollah, as the Americans and Israelis try to phrase it.
Jennifer, I saw you reacting to what Rami was saying there, so I'll give you a chance to jump in. But let me also ask you, I mean, from your vantage point, you say that the ceasefire essentially is on life support, that it's very fragile right now. Are the Americans attempting to constrain the Israelis at all when it comes to Israel? I mean, through this process, are they exerting pressure on Israel, or will they exert more pressure on Israel?
Looking back at how the Trump administration approached Gaza, for example, at the end, I think there is a wide gap between approval of what Israel is doing in southern Lebanon, particularly as it undermines the effort to advance these peace talks, and actually exerting pressure on Israel to stop. There was plenty of criticism of Israel throughout the Gaza conflict, but that, as we know, did not actually translate to policy changes that were effective in restraining Israeli activities there. And I think that we're probably looking at a similar situation now, where there is an acknowledgement that the ongoing strikes, the evacuation orders of southern Lebanese villages that were issued again this morning, and the high death toll, those are all making these talks very difficult to achieve anything. Certainly, as noted in the report, it goes both ways. There have been drone strikes against northern Israel that, again, are giving pretext to Israeli claims that Israelis cannot rehabilitate the northern villages, and that they are essentially under a constant attack. And so this continues to perpetuate this cycle of a lack of trust between the 2 parties that will make it very difficult to achieve anything. I do have to say, I do think that Hezbollah is very much at the heart of this. I agree with that assessment that for the United States, that is the case as well. I also agree that the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, all of Lebanon's partners, France, others, have involved themselves over the course of years, but have not provided the sustained effort that is required to actually move things forward and to provide the Lebanese government with the support that it needs, and the Lebanese armed forces with the support that it needs to actually take over responsibility for Lebanon's security affairs. And until that happens, it is very difficult to see a situation in which Israel respects Lebanon's borders and withdraws according to international requirements. That's, I think, just a reality of what we're facing, regardless of how we got here. And so, I think at the end of the day, the United States needs to put sustained focus on this, on supporting the Lebanese government along with its partners in the international community. This Lebanese government has at least verbally, gone farther than any other that we've heard in decades, and that should be commended and supported. But I am just a little bit skeptical that the Trump administration has the staying power to dedicate itself to that effort. And going back to the start of your question, is in a position to pressure Israel to live up to the commitments to make this a two-sided process.
Ali, let me ask you, how much leverage does Lebanon's government have when it comes to Hezbollah? I mean, even if the Lebanese government were to extend the ceasefire or to enter into more negotiations, what does that mean when it comes to having the necessary leverage over Hezbollah to get Hezbollah either to lay down their weapons or to agree to stop the fighting?
Before I answer that, Alami, I have several points regarding what my colleague from Colorado said. I think that she's focusing a lot on one side of the story. She's alluded more than once that Hezbollah is basically causing the problems, that it's Hezbollah's attacks that are provoking the Israelis, and the Israelis are the ones retaliating. But that's completely inaccurate. If you go back to 2024, when a ceasefire was reached then, Hezbollah completely committed to that ceasefire. And the Israelis were the ones who continuously violated because they believed they could violate simply that Hezbollah, or simply because Hezbollah was in no position to respond or to retaliate. So this idea that the Israelis are defending themselves and they have no ambitions and that Hezbollah is provoking, I think it's actually the other way around. I think the Israelis are the ones who have always been the aggressors. And this idea that the American and Israeli objectives are the same and that Hezbollah poses a threat to American interests, I also take issue with that. American and Israeli interests are not the same. And I'm sure your colleague or my colleague from Colorado knows that. In fact, if you go back to the Obama administration, there was actually indirect cooperation between the Americans and Hezbollah against ISIS, cooperation which took place by the Lebanese military. So America is making Hezbollah an enemy for itself for no other reason other than to satisfy an Israeli agenda. Now, some people would, of course, point to the 1983 Marine barracks bombings. But number one, Hezbollah didn't exist back then. That's number one. Number two, the Americans were actually taking part in a war. They were party to a war at that time. So they weren't considered to be a neutral party. So I think these are all things we have to take into consideration. Now, regarding the fact that the Americans won't be in a position to put pressure on Israel, I think that here it's very important to point out how important Hezbollah is for Iran. Now, if the Trump administration sincerely wants to reach a deal with Iran, I think that Lebanon wouldn't be that big a price to pay in exchange for alleviating the economic difficulties that are arising as a result of the war with Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, and other factors. So given the importance that Iran attaches to Hezbollah, that might in the end force the Americans or push the Americans to put more pressure on Israel. And that did happen, by the way. If you look at what happened in the last round now, yes, the Israelis are attacking, but they were forced in some way to limit their attacks. And I think one reason for that was that Trump doesn't necessarily want to abandon the diplomatic process as a whole with Iran. And finally, regarding your question, I don't think that the Lebanese government has any leverage over Hezbollah, not at all, especially with the stance taken by Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri, who is the leader of the Amal movement, the second main Shia party. He's also against these talks, and that gives Hezbollah, or that strengthens Hezbollah's position as well. So I don't think that the Lebanese government is going into these talks with a lot of domestic backing.
Rami, could you just bring our viewers up to speed with where things stand overall in Lebanon right now? How dire is the situation? How dangerous is the situation there? We know, obviously, that it's very complicated terrain, but for example, how much tension remains between Hezbollah and the government? How does that complicate the overall situation. How bad is the economy? What are the factors that are making things particularly difficult right now?
I can give you one answer to all of your good questions, which is that in all of these domains, the situation is really very difficult. It's very bad. But the fact is, this has been going on for probably 5, 6 decades now. The Israelis first started attacking Lebanon in the 1960s. I remember in the late 60s when I was there, they were bombing places. There wasn't, before 20 years before Hezbollah was created, they were saying they were attacking Palestinian fighters, communists, or whatever. So this is nothing new. The Lebanese, unfortunately, the Lebanese have had to endure this kind of situation for over half a century. The Lebanese government includes Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not an alien force. It's in the parliament. It's in the cabinet. It's deeply embedded in society. It has a lot of support when it repels the Israelis, liberates the South, which it did a couple of times, but it has a lot of criticism from Lebanese when it triggers a new round of fighting because of its resistance. So the Israelis don't want anybody around them to resist them. They don't want any Arab or Iranian or Turkish or any other non-Israeli force to be able to challenge them or to defend themselves against Israeli aggression. And there's 3 things the Lebanese hate. They hate war that's triggered inside the country by Hezbollah or anybody else. But more than that, they hate the Israelis occupying Lebanon and constantly attacking it and bombing it and now doing ethnic cleansing. And they really, really hate the longest issue here is the century of Western colonial manipulation. There was the French first, now it's the Americans coming in and telling the Lebanese, here's what you're going to do, and trying to bribe them with money for reconstruction and things of that nature. So there's a very complex balance of sentiments among Lebanese and all people in the Arab world, that they want sovereignty, they want development, they're willing to live peacefully with Israel. They've clarified it many, many times, especially the Lebanese. But they don't want to be pawns in the hands of Western colonial powers or their surrogates and allies in the state of Israel.
Ali, what kind of process needs to take place? From your vantage point, what kind of process needs to take place, concrete steps, in order for Lebanon to find a real way forward after so many decades of war?
Well, I think that the real problem lies in the Israelis. I think that the Israeli ambitions, and especially with this Israeli government and the announced policy of pursuing a Greater Israel project, and unfortunately there are some American officials like Mike Huckabee who are encouraging these kinds of projects. So I think that has to come under control. Otherwise, there will be no way out. I think another factor, and I believe my colleagues referred to this, is that you need to have a strong Lebanese state. Okay, if you want to get rid of Hezbollah, eliminate Hezbollah, but in the end, the Lebanese people, Lebanon needs to have a deterrent against Israel. Israel's not a normal, peaceful neighbor. You know, we all know the Israeli ambitions. But unfortunately, there's been a policy in place for quite some time which focuses on preserving Israel's military edge, not just vis-a-vis Lebanon, but vis-a-vis the whole region. So if they really want to deal with the situation of Hezbollah, I think that the prudent approach would be, okay, let's enhance the capabilities of the Lebanese army, but really enhance them in a way which would serve as a deterrent. But, you know, that confronts the reality of Israel and the pro-Israeli lobby in Washington. I think that their preferred approach is to keep Lebanon a weak state. That's been evident. The Israeli strategy is to have itself surrounded not just basically by weak states, but even by failed states, because by doing that, that makes it that much easier to pursue the Greater Israel project, which, as I said, has become one of the main focuses of this government.
Jennifer, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but Ali seemed to be touching on some of what you were saying before, which is that in order for the situation to get better, the capabilities of the army in Lebanon need to be enhanced. And you were saying that it seems as though America is not paying enough heed to that. Will the administration or a subsequent administration in the U.S. actually pay attention to that and start giving enough support to Lebanon in order to fulfill that?
So that's a really challenging question. And I want to first just clarify one of Ali's comments. I completely agree that Israel, in this moment and historically, has violated Lebanese sovereignty and played a disruptive, often violent role. I just think it's important that if these talks or any future talks are to succeed, that there needs to be understanding on both sides of similar violations of violence, of the threats that both parties are facing. And I think, until there is an understanding that there are grievances, significant ones on both sides, the likelihood of success is very limited. When it comes to the United States in particular, I think that is a very difficult question. We have seen with this administration, the Trump administration, a real pulling back of assistance to partners and allies around the world with the dismantlement of USAID and other types of assistance. And in order to strengthen the Lebanese armed forces to really take over security in southern Lebanon, that is an enormous investment monetarily. And I'm just not convinced, being candid, that this administration has either the patience or staying power or, frankly, willingness to invest the type of money that is needed in order for that to happen. And unfortunately, that is something that we've seen across the region, across successive administrations.
Rami, we only have about a minute left. I'm sorry to ask you such a big question, but I do want to get your thoughts. How much of a role will Gulf countries, do you think, be playing in this process going forward?
Yeah, the Saudis have led an initiative now of Arab countries and Turkey and Pakistan sometimes to try to get a unified Arab position, or Arab Islamic, to support the Lebanese government. So Lebanon is not isolated by itself against the Israelis in these negotiations, because they'll be pressured and will come up with a terrible agreement like the May 1983 agreement. So, yeah, the Arab people, as governments, would like to support Lebanon, but historically they haven't done a job. The ultimate point, the last point I make it, you can't have the United States host and mediate this discussion while it is the main armorer and diplomatic protector and political supporter of one of the aggressors, which is the Israeli government. It's just totally nonsense. You need a more serious, dispassionate, effective, credible mediator that can bring something about in some kind of international forum, but
Rami,
that's down the road, I suspect.
I am sorry to interrupt you, but we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to our guests, Ali Rizk, Jennifer Gavito, and Rami Khouri. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it for me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay tuned.